Good morning, Belong Collective. Welcome to this week's digital gathering. I'm Pastor Justin. Great to meet you if we've never met before. The Belong Collective is an inclusive, Jesus-shaped community practicing the way of love for the good of all, and we're so thankful that you've joined us for this today, a digital gathering. Typically, we are kind of meeting in person and digital, so depending upon the week, you can go to thebelongcollective.org, click our calendar to see where we're at. Next week, we are at Hershey Lodge at 10 a.m. Hopefully, you're able to join us. More details, again, at that calendar tab at our website. Some of you might be thinking, Justin, what's up with the facial hair? This is a little bit different, but it's Halloween, and I have this as part of my Halloween costume. You'll have to, I guess, check my Instagram or Facebook to see actually what the costume is, because I wasn't going to wear it here. But yeah, so if you're wondering about that, this isn't a new look I'm going for. It's just a fun Halloween. Hopefully you're having a great Halloween, getting some candy, having some fun, fighting through the weather that this weekend has been. Really want to let you know about our Facebook, our Instagram. You can follow us there, learn more about us there. If you want to support the Belong Collective, you can do that through our website. Ultimately, our website is where you can get almost all the information. You're probably watching this maybe on Facebook or on YouTube. You can follow us there as well for when we do these digital gatherings. If you fill out a Connect card on our website, you'll actually get an email list. You'll get subscribed to an email list, and you can connect with us in that way. You'll get some updates about different things we're doing. On top of all of that, if you want to reach out with questions or anything, you can email me at justin@thebelongcollective.org. Thanks for joining us today. Really looking forward to this digital gathering.
Nothing can separate, even if I ran away. Your love never fails. I know I still make mistakes, but you have new mercies for me every day. Your love never fails. Stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, 'cause I know that you love me. Your love never fails. Wind is strong and the water's deep, but I'm not alone in these open seas, 'cause your love never fails. Far too wide. I never thought I'd reach the other side, but your love never fails. 'Cause you stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fails. Oh no, your love together for my good. Jesus, you made all things work together for my good. Lord, you made all things work together for my good. You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fails. Oh no, your love never fails.
And now let us pray together through the words of Mother Teresa. Dear Jesus, help us to spread your fragrance everywhere we go. Flood our souls with your spirit and life. Penetrate and possess our whole being so utterly that our lives may only be a radiance of yours. Shine through us and be so in us that every soul we come in contact with may feel your presence in our soul. Let them look up and see no longer us, but only Jesus. Stay with us, and then we shall begin to shine as you shine. So to shine as to be light to others. The light, O Jesus, will be all from you. None of it will be ours. It will be you shining on others through us. Let us thus praise you in the way you love best, by shining on those around us. Let us preach you without preaching, not by words, but by our example. By the catching force, the sympathetic influence of what we do, the evident fullness of the love our hearts bear to you. Amen.
All right, so we're continuing in a series called Built Different. And what we've been talking about is our values at the Belong Collective and how, in some ways, we're built differently than other communities. And so you can go to our website, you can click on Purpose at the top tab, and there'll be a drop-down tab, and you can click Values, and you can see our 6 core values. Through this series, we've been kind of diving deep into each one of those 6. And so today, we're diving deep into another one of our values. But before starting that, before telling you even what that value is, I wanted to tell you a story about Jesus. It's in Mark chapter 5, verse 21. And here's how it reads. I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about it, okay? Here we go. Mark chapter 5, verse 21 through 34. It reads this way. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, really important detail there, synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, a few things here in the story. Jesus arrives in a new location, and a synagogue leader approaches him with a problem. The problem is his daughter's dead. This is a really just painful scenario. This synagogue leader is mourning the loss of his daughter, hears that Jesus is coming into town, or that he's come onto the shore of their town, and thinks to himself, I've heard about this guy, maybe he can heal my dying or dead daughter. And so he rushes to meet Jesus, falls at his feet and says, "Come, please heal my daughter." And Jesus says, "Okay." And so this man believes that Jesus has the power to do it. But he's a synagogue leader, which is an important detail that the text gives us. And in my belief here, I think this is intentional, that we understand this person's background, this person's experience, someone who would have been incredibly committed to the law. And as they're on their way, a crowd gathers. And one of the people in this crowd is someone who's been suffering from bleeding for 12 years. That's a long time to be suffering from this. Would have probably been widely known by the community as someone to avoid. In Jewish rituals, like cleanliness is really important. If you touch someone who's bleeding, you have to stay out of the temple. You have to disconnect yourself. You have a period of what's called ritual cleansing that you have to go through. It's a very difficult process in that culture, and so you avoid it. These types of people would have been avoided. In a crowd, when they reach out and touch you, this is very problematic for Jesus. Problematic especially as he's standing next to a synagogue leader who's like, hold on, you were touched by a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. What's that mean? So Jesus is touched, feels some type of power go out of him, which is a whole interesting conversation to think about. Jesus having some kind of supernatural powers and feeling them release from him, feeling that power transfer. Like, this is just, I think sometimes we don't pause and reflect on the supernatural that's being communicated in the scriptures and how we believe about that, what we think about that. It's very interesting here that Jesus seemingly releases this power without knowledge or direction. He's like, I felt this release from me. And so in this experience of this woman being healed, she's experienced the healing. Now Jesus is aware that this healing power has left him, and he's surrounded by a large group of people, and he says, "Who touched me?" And then the disciples are like, "What do you mean, who touched you? Everyone's touching you. We're all in this huge crowd as we're traveling to the synagogue leader's house." And Jesus is like, "No, I need to find out who touched me." Now, in the woman's mind at this point, when she realizes, Jesus realizes, but then realizes that Jesus isn't going to let it go, Jesus is going to find out who touched him. This has got to be a moment of great fear for this woman, because in her mind, she's like, if he finds out it's me that touched him, who has been bleeding for 12 years, it is going to lead this new rabbi to be ceremonially unclean. It's going to create all kinds of potential problems, and I'm potentially going to be disciplined for that, pushed out, or an outcast for that. And so she then comes forward, says it's me, and the text even says she was afraid, and falls at his feet. And what does Jesus do? Jesus blesses her for her faith. Wow, this is like the stereotypical response that someone would have been like reading this for the first time in a Jewish context and expecting this person to respond. They would have expected it to be, at the very least, this like verbal admonishment and frustration and anger for reaching out and touching. At the very least, taking the power away from Jesus, maybe. You could maybe say Jesus would get angry about that. But ultimately, I think, as I read the text and I read it in the context of this particular time and place, ceremonial cleanliness being something important, Jesus has now had a physical interaction with this woman. And so, I don't think it's by accident that it happens while he's with a synagogue leader. Now, he goes on to heal the synagogue leader's daughter. That's not really part of the story today. We're not going to, you can continue reading that if you want to and read the remainder of the story and maybe pull out other details there. But ultimately, for the purpose of today, what I think is interesting is that Jesus is consistently championing the poor, the oppressed, those who are outcasts, those who don't fit the system, those who stereotypically the church would have, or the temple would have pushed away, and the synagogue would have shunned, maybe even. And in this particular case, he finds himself, dare I say, not accidentally, with a synagogue leader while he's doing it, and that synagogue leader is begging for his daughter's life. In essence, more open to something new than he's probably ever been, because his daughter's life is on the line here, and he sees Jesus do something completely uncharacteristic, and then they move on to his house. And I say this just because I think we could go to 20 different passages in the New Testament to pull how Jesus challenges the stereotypes while the Pharisees are present, while the Sadducees are present, while these high-level leaders are present. But even here with the synagogue leader, a lower-level leader, Jesus doesn't miss the opportunity to point out that the stereotype that she doesn't belong, or that she is cursed, or that healing is for your daughter because you're in a position of privilege in the religious world, but not for her, who probably hasn't been able to participate in anything religious for 12 years. Not only the fact that she's been bleeding, but also the fact that she's a woman would have been a very different experience. So all of these things matter. And Jesus flips it completely upside down by healing this woman, but also by not reprimanding her for reaching out and touching him. Now, as I said, we could go to 20 different places to show in the scriptures where Jesus turns things upside down, where Jesus challenges the stereotypes of his day. And that is the value we're talking about today. The value that we have is called overcoming church stereotypes. One of our values at the Belong Collective is that we want to overcome church stereotypes because we believe Jesus overcame the stereotypes of his day. And so we should overcome the stereotypes of the church that exists today. That's not to say the stereotypes aren't real. That's not to say the stereotypes aren't valid. That's not to say that we haven't earned a reputation where people who come into the church with particular stereotypical understandings of what church should be, that we shouldn't have a certain amount of empathy and understanding for the way they've probably experienced the church or the fears that they're coming in with. It's just that we want to be self-aware enough as a church to say we have to be mindful of the stereotypes that we prop up, of the ways that we go about doing church in a way that might unknowingly be this religious way of doing things. We've always done it this way, or even hurting people where we don't even recognize we're doing it. So some stereotypes are very practical stereotypes. Some stereotypes are very theological stereotypes. Some stereotypes are very, I guess, just like judgments that we place, and that we ultimately, it's less about theology and more about the way the church has acted over a long period of time. And again, in my experience, most church stereotypes, when I talk to a random person off the street who doesn't necessarily go to church regularly, when they tell me what their church stereotypes are, they're usually pretty spot on with what church can be, and in a lot of ways has been for a lot of people. And so in each of these particular buckets of values that we have a paragraph written under. Again, you can go to our website, thebelongcollective.org. You can click on purpose, and then there'll be a drop-down tab where you can click on values and you can see these. But I'm going to go ahead and read the paragraph, and then I want to talk about some different things within the paragraph. So here's how the paragraph under overcoming church stereotypes reads. We value a flexible theology that is unafraid of real-life questions, elevating faithful questioning over unquestioning obedience. Everything is evolving, including our faith and connection to the divine. Questions are the gateway through which we grow communally and individually. Just as a child is exploring their world and therefore engages their parents with questions after question after question, for sure. As a parent, I agree. We believe the community of faith should be a place where questions are not simply allowed, but invited. The community of faith throughout history has had a number of beautiful, life-giving, and loving theologies and practices. But there have been, and currently are, many ugly, destructive, and hate-filled theologies and practices. It is our hope that the community of faith would continue to evolve toward a more beautiful, life-giving, and loving theology and practice. We do this by owning our past failures and seeking to reconcile that which has been broken, while embodying a flexible theology open to the leading of the Spirit. So of all the values that we share, this one has probably the largest paragraph, I think, mainly because we wanted to get so much into this bucket. We talk about a lot of different things here. I guess what I would say is church stereotypes are pretty broad. They're pretty big when we think about all the different stereotypes that people come to church with. And so we were pretty broad with the paragraph and what we say here. So there's some terminology in here and some things we say in here. I'm going to talk about 4 main things that we say when we talk about overcoming church stereotypes. Number 1 is a flexible theology. What does that mean? For some, that's going to ring alarm bells, and I totally understand. There was a time in my life where if you would have said flexible theology, I would have ran away from you and maybe even called you a heretic. I don't know. Or at least I would have been very suspect of you because you aren't holding to the truth. You're saying we need to hold our faith flexibly and understand God maybe a little bit differently than someone else might. And what does that mean? If truth exists, how do we understand these things differently? Well, one thing I've come to learn, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'm willing to admit that, is that the dogmatic version of my faith that I held for a while, the very fundamentalist, there's no other way of understanding this type of faith, it did not serve me well. The theologies and the pride and arrogance in which I held those did not serve me well, did not serve the people that I led in ministry, or even the people in my circle relationally when I was incredibly dogmatic about my faith. Again, it led to, I think, a level of pride and arrogance that I was right and others were wrong. And it also led me to a place where I was more interested in finding out how I was right, consistently finding ways to defend the ways I was right, and study up on the ways that I could convince people that I was right and they were wrong. And ultimately, I think it led to me studying the Bible not for the purpose of personal growth, to look more like Jesus, but to study the Bible for the purpose of winning a debate or winning an argument against somebody about how my theology was better than theirs. And so when we talk about a flexible theology, we're talking about a rejection of this dogmatic, fundamentalist, traditional, inflexible theology that we see in so many churches. And so some people come into churches with the stereotype that this church is going to be dogmatic or traditional or inflexible in the way they understand theology. And what we want to say is we want you to come in and understand the church to be flexible in our theology. And what does that mean, flexible in our theology? What we mean is we're going to meet you where you're at in your theology. And we're ultimately also going to say we're willing to evolve in our own theology. We use that language in this paragraph. We use the language of evolve because we feel when we look back, most of us, when we look back over the last 10 years, we've probably learned something about God, whether that's through experiences we've had with people, just revelation we've had as we've read the scriptures, as we've done community with others, as, the Holy Spirit's leading us. There's this understanding that things can be made new, even our understandings and our theology. And so we never want to grip our theology so tight that we're not willing to let go of it and grab hold of what might be new and available to us. And so our theology is flexible. It's not that we don't believe or we don't have a deep faith because we're flexible. It's that our faith is so deep that we're open to what God might reveal to us. And so that's the type of community we want to be. That's the type of people we want to be. We don't want to become this inflexible group that ultimately says, this is the only way. There is no other way of understanding it, especially on secondary principles. I would say if we are dogmatic about anything, it is the way of love, and that Jesus loved deeply and that we're called to love deeply. And so from that place, if that's the one thing we're accused of being dogmatic on, if that's the thing that we're accused of being fundamentalists for love, then maybe I'm okay in that. But you got to realize when you go out into the world of church, people, can't become members of church because of their view of baptism, their view of communion, their view of just things that you would find so incredibly random. Not to mention the myriad of views on things like human sexuality, on the understandings of racism and the importance of that in the church, or the lack of importance of that in the church. We could go on to justice issues as it relates to theology, or we could just go into theology as it relates to theology. And here's my deal. This isn't an excuse. Flexible theology isn't an excuse to disconnect from the cerebral, the reality that we need to be engaged with our mind into the scriptures. It's not like I'm just going to disconnect that, but it's a reprioritization of values, because for some churches, they live in the head and it rarely gets to the heart or to the hands. And I would say we want our heart to be transformed for God and ultimately to serve one another. And yes, we want our head to be a part of that. These should all be working together. But what we want to really be cautious to do is to be so theologically fundamental that we lose the ability to serve our neighbor, love our neighbor well. And so we use language like flexible theology because ultimately my theological opinion has flexed over time on a number of issues, more than I could even communicate currently. And I believe that as people, let's say this, I'm 37 right now. When I'm 47, I hope my theology has changed. I will be deeply frustrated if it hasn't, because it'll probably mean I've disconnected from the work that I need to do and from the people I need to serve. Because ultimately, when I'm serving people, God's revealing things to me. And so I would say we desire to be a flexible, a community that overcomes church stereotypes by having a flexible theology for the purpose of growth, of spiritual growth. And so that's important to us. All right, next, number 2. Real life questions. We make it so clear here that we mention questions and the ability to ask questions and this open dialogue multiple times in this paragraph. And part of the reason we do this is because one of the stereotypes that churches have is that you're not allowed to ask questions. Now, some of this goes back to the theological piece, but even when you ask questions about process of boards and how they do things, some churches can be really, really, really guarded and defensive about how they do things, why they do things. You might ask a question about why we haven't done an outreach event. This isn't a theological question necessarily. It's a, why haven't we done this service event? Here's this great opportunity that exists. And you're met with, no, we're not doing that. And not really a conversation, or not really an understanding of a bigger principle at work, or, communication, I think, in a lot of churches is lacking. And so when we say real life questions, what we're saying is 2 things. We want you to be involved in the process of why are we doing it this way? What is the process of coming to that conclusion? Why did we choose to do this? I think you should know that. And sometimes we do a good job of communicating at the Belong Collective, and sometimes we don't. And I want to own that. So never be afraid to shoot me an email, justin@thebelongcollective.org. My email does not get read by someone else and then filtered and sent to me. It's me. You're communicating with me. And many of you know that. Many of you shoot me Facebook messages, Instagram messages, and communicate with me that way. That's fine too. But ultimately, I want to be accessible to you. Our board is accessible to you. You can see who our board support is on our website. You can talk to them when you're at church, or you can reach out to them individually as well. We want to be a community that ultimately is accessible to you in the ability to communicate and understand why we do what we do, and even the process for how we do it. Now, the other, I think even potentially not more important, but equally important piece is real life questions. For so long, the church has had this kind of traditional theology, but even the way of applying it, that we're not actually answering real life questions. Here's what I mean. When someone gets up and talks about soteriology, right? Or I'm just going to throw out big theological words, transubstantiation or consubstantiation, and this is the preaching and the sermon. They're not answering the questions that people are asking. And what I mean is, like, they might not even be aware of the questions people are asking. For example, I could preach a sermon on transubstantiation and consubstantiation in our next series. That would be a series, by the way, if you're unfamiliar, on communion and what we believe is happening when we take communion. These are long-held debates between various different denominations and groups on whether or not the Catholic view, for example, would be that the elements become the body and blood of Jesus. And then you have transubstantiation, or that is transubstantiation. Then you have consubstantiation, which is like, well, it's kind of a mystical, different way of, and I could go really deep into all the definers of that, or any other theological, buckets, right? Here's the thing. Here's what I know. And I'm just going to say this. Over the last, we'll just say the last 3 years of my life, I've had no one ask me any questions of communion. You know what? I'll say over the last 10 years of my life, I can't think of anyone coming to me and asking me about the theology of communion, where I stand on it, what I believe happens to the elements, or when we were our former name or currently the Belong Collective, what we believed about communion. I literally can't remember a time when that's happened. Yet, this Sunday, right now, while I'm preaching, there are multiple pastors preaching, answering questions that people aren't asking. And that's not to say what they're saying doesn't matter. It's just to say there's a disconnect and an out of touchness with real life questions. Here's what I know from just the last 2 years. People are asking questions like, what does everything happening in the world right now mean for the church? What's truth in the world when things like QAnon are taking off and are deeply connected to Christianity? What the state of our politics and the state of it being intertwined with Christianity, Christian nationalism, what is happening with this? And how are we going to disconnect this? I have people asking questions like, my marriage has suffered so much since COVID started. Like, relationally speaking, marriage and family have been challenged in ways I've never experienced before. I don't know what to do. I know people who are like, I lost my job and I don't have purpose or meaning anymore. What should I be doing? How do I recapture some ability to move on after this challenge? I have people who will say, I'm lonely. I've been more isolated in the last 2 years than I've ever been. I'm depressed, but I've never experienced depression before. I'm anxious and I've never experienced anxiety before. What do I do? These are just a handful of real life questions that I believe Scripture and your faith community should be speaking to. Not only exclusively, I'm not saying that's the only group that gets a say in these areas, but I'm saying this should be a hopefully a community that's willing to answer these real life questions, real life challenges, real life things that exist in our world. And so how can we as a church answer real life questions instead of just preaching theologies that ultimately aren't necessarily impacting people in their day-to-day lives? We want to be a community where questions can be asked, things can be explored, and we can grow deeper together while we handle some of these practical challenges that exist in our world, Jesus was incredibly practical in his world, and so we should be as well. All right, at one point in here, we talk about owning our past. This is point number 3. We talk about owning our past and our reputation and the stereotypes that we have. We have a reputation. When someone walks into our community, we have a reputation. Now, that might be that the reputation, we'll just talk about the Belong Collective. The reputation of the Belong Collective is that we are a rebellious bunch, right? Because we left our denomination in protest, which we did, and maybe they're aware of that. Maybe they don't know anything about that, and they're like, they walk in with a very different stereotype or understanding. I saw they have a Facebook page, and I've never seen a church with a Facebook page. I don't know. There's so many stereotypes that people can walk in with without ever knowing. They can see me with tattoos and earrings, and immediately a stereotype comes to mind. And so it's not that stereotypes are always a negative thing. Let me say that. But there are some stereotypes that I'm going to say the Big C church, the collective church, has earned that we as a community, while that's not something we've, contributed to, we have to acknowledge that it exists. We have to own it and work for the reconciliation of that reality. Like, we have to understand that that reputation is attached to us even if we don't like it, and even if we're actually adamantly against it. So here's an example. A friend wanted to come to the Belong Collective, and I said, yeah, come on out. Like, I think it'd be really good for you. Maybe it'd be something you enjoyed. Maybe it won't be, but come on out, try it out. The first question they asked me, what should I wear? And this is a question I get a lot. People are like, what am I supposed to wear? Like, I don't want to be underdressed or overdressed, or I don't want to be. Now, part of it is whenever you're walking into a community of different people, you and I forget, because maybe the Belong Collective has been our home for so long that we don't realize that there's a lot of anxiety on, like, I don't want to look weird or not look the part or be disrespectful to somebody by the clothes I'm wearing or the way I look. And so there's anxiety around what should I wear. But ultimately, like, we have to understand that that kind of culture exists. And ultimately, our community, if you've ever asked that question or wondered that, you can wear whatever you want to the Belong Collective. This isn't an issue for us. But for some churches, though, they focused a lot on what you wear. I've been in churches that have said certain clothing and attire was necessary for anyone who is going to be on stage. And often that dress code affected females far more than it affected me. And this type of kind of, I guess, stereotype of, like, I better be dressed right, isn't coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of people feeling out of place, people feeling like they don't belong. And so we want to create a space where people feel like they belong. They don't feel like they're out of place. They feel like they're right at place when they're here. And so we're not going to place standards and focus on what we wear. And so that's one way. But another way is to say, someone walks into the church and says, for example, the church has been traditionally racist. And racism runs rampant in churches today, especially churches with white pastors. And I would say, yeah, it's true. That's not an unfair stereotype. That is a very fair stereotype, especially for white evangelical churches, of which we look a lot like. Not that I would say we are an evangelical church. So how do we go about undoing that? That's a question that I think is something that takes tons of time, how we undo that type of a stereotype, or if it can even be undone, or if it should be undone. It should maybe be something that, instead of undoing, because you can't undo that kind of hurt. You can't undo the reality that during the civil rights movement, white churches were the thing that Martin Luther King Jr. was most frustrated with. Like, go read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and it is the white church leaders that are not mobilizing their communities that believe in Jesus for the freedom and liberation of the African American community. And even when you go back to slavery, we love to talk about how the church had there were Christian abolitionists, which there was still a large, overwhelming majority of Christians who were not for the freedom of slaves. And so when we look at our lineage as a country connected to matters of racism, we have not done well. And so we own that past. We don't try to sugarcoat it. We don't try to say it's something different, which is what most churches try to do. They try to act like that didn't happen, or act like, well, we're going to emphasize this one story of this one Christian who did it this way. We can champion that story as someone who went against the grain, because that's what they did. They went against the grain, and talk about how we're going to be the type of community that's going to go against the grain today, because we believe in that same spirit of love, liberation, and freedom being championed, and ultimately unity and equality. And so when we talk about owning the past, it's the idea that we're not going to try to sugarcoat it when the church is messed up. If you look at 2,000 years of church history, man alive, there's a lot of places you can go and just show just how jacked up the church is. There's also a lot of places you can go and show how the church has risen to the occasion, loved well, given people the community and hope, and ultimately like champion the way of Jesus. You can find that too. I'm not saying it's just one side, but what I will say is I think if you want the one side of the coin that is the hopeful side of what the church can be and at times has been, you can't ignore the times where it has missed the mark. You have to own the past so that you can work for a more hopeful future. And so that's what we're trying to do. And so that leads me to my fourth point: working to reconcile and build something new. We own that past because we want to be the type of community that is working to reconcile and build something new. Not something built around all these stereotypes, but something built around love. Something built around something new, like the way of Jesus. Like, how radical is it that I say the church should be stereotypically peaceful? What? That is kind of radical today. But if we're going to say we're going to be stereotypically so attached to the way of Jesus that we refuse to embody something else, we would say, well, what if the church was peaceful? What if the church championed peace in like a real way? Like, that would challenge some people. That would push some people. It really would. What if the church was known for hanging out with drug addicts? Well, hold on. You can't hang out with those people. Like, they're dangerous. They're, but what about Jesus hanging out with tax collectors? Like, the way of Jesus. What if we were known for the way of Jesus? What if the stereotype was actually those people like are too inclusive? Like they cross a line. They just don't have very good boundaries like that. What if that was actually the critique and stereotype of the church, is that community is just too hopeful in that person could potentially be redeemed, or that something could change in that person's life? That's the stereotype I want to work for. That's the stereotype that I would much rather the something new, the new generation of the church, whatever's going to birth out of what's happening even currently in the church, would be something that goes the other direction on a lot of these stereotypes that we've earned, that is radically inclusive, that seeks equity for all, women, minorities. We have to, I think, as a community, push this, largely because I don't see many other churches doing it. It's really disheartening as a pastor to see where the church is at today, because I would say over the last few years, we've picked up stereotypes that are going to be with us for a long time and are 100% earned, because every poll that is done shows that is where church people and church leaders are. And I'm not going to get very distinct on what I'm talking about, but it's certainly the intersection of politics and political leaders. And If we can't envision something different, and if that's what we're going to be, then we aren't following Jesus anymore. And we might as well just stop calling our churches, and we might as well just stop saying we're following Jesus when we're not. And so when we talk about overcoming church stereotypes, it's not this like, hey, wear whatever you want to church. That's part of it. But bigger is that the church is at stake here if we don't realign what we value in a way to say these stereotypes that have so shaped us for history in a negative way, in some places are only getting worse. And unless we push back and challenge that, even at times aggressively, the idea of a Christ-following church may no longer exist. And so I feel compelled to say, I want to work to reconcile and build something new and overcome the church stereotypes that have long existed and that are new to the block. So pray with me. Good and gracious God, may we be the type of people that are like you. Not just our community, the Belong Collective, but even as individuals, that we would be the type of people that are looking at the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years and show mercy, whoever that might be. In our community, that might be someone that everyone tells us we should be disconnected from, we should have a safe distance from, but we find a way to bridge that gap. We find a way to show and express love. And maybe we even do it in a public way, like Jesus did, a very public way. God, if it brings shame on us, but it ultimately elevates love and grace and hope in our world, may we never be afraid to be ashamed for you. God, we desire to love deeply and to be hope bringers in a world where there's so little hope right now. And so, by your Spirit, show us that way as individuals and as a community, the Belong Collective, that we might overcome some of these stereotypes that we've earned. And God, I pray for the many, many people who have been hurt by these stereotypes, whether that was the feeling of shame or a disconnection and not belonging because of a certain type of clothing they wore to church. What a petty, small thing for them to miss the opportunity to experience your love. But that's real in their life, and that's something they've experienced, and I pray that you might provide healing and a different experience. And for those who have experienced the deep pain of church stereotypes, maybe racism or sexism or homophobia, the things that the church in so many polls is known for, God, may we be the type that would reconcile even that. May your Spirit be the type that would even move people to potentially step out and connect with church again. And ultimately, maybe, God, the thing for them is to not connect with church again. But ultimately, our prayer is that they would be able to connect with you, even if they can't connect with church. God, this is no small thing. We know it's going to take us being incredibly flexible to the new things you're doing in our world. And so grow in us an ability to remain flexible in how we see you and how we see each other. In the name of Jesus, amen.